Ladies and gentlemen, after decades of deliberations and gradual steps, the international community has in recent years made considerable headway regarding the rights of Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, it is a special pleasure for me to welcome the many Indigenous representatives from all regions of the world, including the recipients of our voluntary fund for Indigenous populations.
That I come all the way from Tanzania, from the Maasai community. I represent the Maasai Women Development Organization in Tanzania.
I came from Russia. We are here to participate in the second session of the expert mechanism.
And one of the reasons why we're here is, as a nation, like any other nation, we're here to advocate for the fundamental rights of our people.
The human rights machinery of the United Nations has undergone major changes in recent years. In 2006, the United Nations established the Human Rights Council, which is now the main intergovernmental body dealing with human rights. And if you deal with human rights, it is clear that you have to also deal with the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is a key issue now also for the Human Rights Council. And indeed, the Human Rights Council started by endorsing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and then went on to establish a specific committee to deal with these rights and Indigenous rights issues in general, and that is the expert mechanism.
Well, the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples is one of three specific UN mandates on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and it is the newest of the three mandates. We have the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and then we have the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Tariglam na gato kani dini, ipat na kabusiba ni ka, labi na kani. Okay, gato din sa kakani nang magbugay yan namin. Mama nag.
Today, we celebrated the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Nearly 15 years have passed since the General Assembly marked this day to commemorate the Indigenous peoples of the world. Since then, Indigenous peoples have achieved historic accomplishments and a greater voice at the international level than ever before. I'm impressed and enormously proud of the successes achieved in the last 15 years by Indigenous peoples. This is truly a cause for celebration. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples is different from the expert mechanisms mandate. Both are mechanisms of the United Nations Human Rights Council. But while the mandate of the Special Rapporteur is to focus on specific situations, problem situations, or situations in which there is progress towards implementing Indigenous people's rights in specific cases, in contrast, the mandate of the expert mechanism is to do thematic studies, not to focus necessarily on specific cases or primarily on specific cases, but studies about issues, about topics of concern, of general concern to Indigenous peoples throughout the world. These are complementary mandates, but distinct. In both cases, participation of Indigenous peoples is important and I would say essential.
I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Carlos Mamani.
A nombre del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas de las Naciones Unidas, es un grato honor participar del segundo periodo de sesiones del Mecanismo de Expertos sobre los Derechos Humanos de los Pueblos Indígenas, que, como señala su mandato, proporciona al Consejo de Derechos Humanos conocimientos temáticos especializados sobre los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas. Nos interesa mucho el poder coordinar con los mecanismos que tratan asuntos o derechos de los pueblos indígenas.
While your mechanism is the newest in the UN's toolbox, I believe it is already emerging as a key actor. It can make a significant contribution to the advancement of the rights of Indigenous peoples by providing the Human Rights Council with well-grounded, independent, and constructive thematic advice.
Es importante también resaltar que el mecanismo de expertos para los derechos de los pueblos indígenas tiene también la capacidad de desarrollar colaboraciones con otros mecanismos de derechos humanos a nivel universal, pero también a nivel regional, y podría ser en un futuro con incluso las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos. Por dar un ejemplo, en la segunda sesión del mecanismo ha participado el presidente del grupo de trabajo sobre las poblaciones indígenas del sistema regional africano en relación con los derechos humanos. Esos son algunos mecanismos adicionales con los cuales el mecanismo de experto podrá contar a futuro para desarrollar su trabajo.
Y al ser un mecanismo nuevo, un espacio nuevo, genera definitivamente muchas expectativas.
Creo que el potencial que tiene, que es un escenario que costó mucho trabajo porque no fue un regalo de los estados, sino que fue una demanda de los pueblos, una demanda muy sentida, tener una instancia reconocida por los estados donde poder analizar la situación de amenaza que viven los pueblos indígenas. Por lo tanto, a la medida que se fortalezca esta instancia, que adquiera mayor entidad y mayor jerarquía, existen más posibilidades de que la voz de los pueblos indígenas sea escuchada.
Lo que tenemos que entender claramente, y sobre todo los hermanos indígenas tienen que entender, es que este órgano está a un altísimo nivel dentro del sistema de las Naciones Unidas. El Consejo de Derechos Humanos es un órgano subsidiario de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas y nosotros somos un órgano subsidiario del Consejo de Derechos Humanos.
Out of the 5 experts, 4 are indigenous peoples. Usually the UN, never says anything about it has to be indigenous peoples, but the Council resolution says preferably of indigenous origin, and I think this is quite important. So we have 5 members. One is John, who is a Sami. Second member, the other member is Jose Carlos. He is from indigenous from Costa Rica. There's Jose Molintas, also an indigenous from Cordillera in the Philippines. Myself, I'm from Sabah, Malaysia. I'm a Kadazan. And then we have Catherine. Catherine is a non-indigenous person, but she works together with indigenous peoples for many years.
I also would like to inform that during the lunchtime there will be 2 events, one in room 24 on good practices and challenges in the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Asia.
Now, the rights of indigenous peoples has been an important issue for the Office of the High Commissioner and for the High Commissioner for many years already, and the office was instrumental in the context of drafting of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And now one of our key responsibilities is to provide services to the expert mechanism. That means organizing meetings, providing other types of support for the expert mechanism.
The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights played a very central role already, and that was during the process of preparing the draft declaration and as well during the negotiations that led to the adoption of the draft declaration. The adoption was really a landmark achievement, we feel. It's having a major impact on the design and the focus of the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it's also having an impact on how other UN agencies, other members of the UN family are implementing their work with Indigenous peoples.
Expert mechanism is open for various participants. That means governments, UN agencies, individual experts, NGOs, indigenous peoples organizations. And it's very important to note that the expert mechanism is open for indigenous peoples organizations, regardless of whether they have the so-called consultative status with OHCHR.
Pueden venir delegados de organizaciones indígenas, delegados de ONGs, delegados de los gobiernos, que es muy importante que estén presentes, delegados académicos, de universidades, investigadores, etc. Es abierto.
Indigenous peoples are those with the most direct knowledge. Obviously, they're the ones who are living the problems or challenges or successes or advances of indigenous peoples themselves, the perspectives they bring about their own experiences, the information they bring about their conditions best comes from them. And so I would say, and I'm sure, I'm quite confident the members of the expert mechanisms themselves would say that their work really can't be done effectively without the participation of indigenous peoples.
El mecanismo de expertos va a funcionar en la medida en que nosotros lo hagamos funcionar, en la medida en que nosotros podamos aportar, en la medida en que nosotros podamos también contribuir y podamos tener una cierta articulación con los expertos.
We're using the caucus, no, as our mechanism to understand each other, as well as to identify what common issues can we work together, but also respecting the diversity of each group, and at the same time being able to move forward with issues that we think is important to all of us. So it gives a stronger voice when we come up with common position and common statement.
And we couldn't do it without the support of a lot of people, a lot of support groups here, particularly in Europe. You know, Indigenous and IFGIA, the Swiss Fund, the Human Rights Fund, all of these organizations helped to bring indigenous people to Geneva. And without them, I don't think we don't have the presence. And indigenous people, keep in mind, are the poorest of the poor in any state that they come in, even the developed countries. And so they need help and resources to get to the United Nations. And so the work of support groups and voluntary contributions by states and foundations is critical to the ongoing participation of indigenous people at this level.
Te decía entonces que hay que generar un poco de diálogo, de sinergias, creo que es importante.
Indigenous people here who meets as Indigenous caucus, and then there's the states. So we take opportunity to meet both, and of course we listen to them, because we want to make sure that, of course, these are of interest to both parties, Indigenous peoples and governments.
The expert mechanism is an important body for Indigenous peoples to ensure that the new Human Rights Council of the United Nations is receiving direct advice from the Aboriginal peoples themselves. The most important thing, particularly for Aboriginal people from Australia, is that we need to have an alternative to dealing with the government to get a fair hearing of our rights. For us, the United Nations is the obvious place. For many reasons, but it also means that we can talk to governments, and particularly governments like Australia, about rights at a more equal level.
En estos momentos en los gobiernos, en los estados hay mucha sensibilidad en los temas indígenas que antes no había. Entonces pensamos de que hay mucha posibilidad de implementar, ¿verdad?, las recomendaciones que hagan los expertos indígenas o no indígenas sobre el tema del cual estamos hablando en caso de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas.
Ahora la función ya no es el de denuncia como se tenía antes, o venir a exponer, acusar a Estado. No, ahora venimos a tratar temas específicos. Para eso hay que preparar estudios, investigaciones sobre determinados temas para hacérselos plantear al Consejo con miras a ir buscando soluciones a los grandes retos que tenemos en nuestros pueblos. Cada año se trata un tema específico, esta vez fue la educación y vamos a analizar lo referente a la aplicación de la implementación de la Declaración de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas a nivel regional y nacional.
States are expected to equip indigenous communities by integrating their perspectives and languages into mainstream education systems and institutions.
Our Bureau of Indian Education's mission is to provide quality education opportunities from early childhood through life in accordance with the tribe's need for cultural and economic well-being, in keeping with the wide diversity of Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages as distinct cultural and governmental entities.
We need to be effective in our policies and programs on the rights to education for Indigenous peoples, or the consequences will be felt sharply and will exacerbate in the coming years, and the impacts will be with us for generations.
Nous estimons que l'éducation doit offrir une grande place à la culture, aux arts et à la langue des peuples autochtones. Les Keltamachak Touareg, par exemple, sont une écriture millénaire. Le Tifina qui n'est pas enseigné et qui est menacé de disparition.
The government should develop a syllabus that respects the traditional livelihood system of indigenous peoples, providing education that will give children ability to make rational choices on their own.
Madam Chairperson, the extreme level of poverty that characterizes the majority of African indigenous communities is yet another major constraint to their full enjoyment of the right to education.
I just wanted to inform you.
Elle nous permettrait à court et à long terme
Before the second session, we decided that we wanted to include the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a separate agenda item at our meeting.
A pesar de que el mecanismo es un instrumento nuevo, esperamos que sea también uno de los vehículos que nos permita avanzar en la defensa y en el desarrollo y la implementación de los derechos que ya se han reconocido.
Es importante que todos los asuntos que conciernen a los pueblos indígenas debe tratarse en el marco de la declaración. Creo que es un principio básico partir del derecho a la libre determinación, el reconocimiento del territorio y el reconocimiento también a la cualidad de pueblos y naciones que tenemos los pueblos indígenas.
Yeah, of course there is a big gap between of what government declare and measures or implementation plan. So, and our task being also here to get closer between declaration paper, how to move to the action plan approved and implemented by the government.
As we know very well, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, although it has been endorsed by many states, there are still some states who are not comfortable with the language, and therefore continuing dialogue and continuing partnership with indigenous peoples in implementing it is very important.
In most African countries where you read into constitution provision where international instruments become automatically part of domestic law by the simple or mere ratification by a given government. And this is very, very valuable, and there has been cases in Africa where actually lawyers and judges have referred to international instruments defending human rights cases and cases relating to indigenous rights by the simple fact that their country has ratified that instrument.
La femme autochtone plutôt qui se retrouve généralement dans une situation de double marginalisation. D'abord marginalisée parce qu'elle est femme, et ensuite, la deuxième fois marginalisée parce qu'elle est femme autochtone. Donc que ce soit pour la femme autochtone pygmée, cette déclaration vient en quelque sorte nous aider à remettre à niveau sa situation qui est un peu encore moins favorable que la situation des autres femmes dans le continent africain.
Nous gardons espoir pour la mise en œuvre de la déclaration sur les droits du peuple autochtone en Afrique. C'est quand même une déclaration qui mérite, pour avoir un effet positif et concret, d'être plus connue par la société civile en général, les autres ONG nationales, les communautés autochtones elles-mêmes.
I think there's a role for the export mechanism, and I've said it to the colleagues in the members of the expert mechanism, in helping define and understand better the articles of the declaration. Understand them better, not necessarily in giving a legal interpretation, but in understanding their content, understanding what is the background, giving good examples or good practices from around the world and how that article is implemented. In other words, giving something to states that they can use in a practical way when they're trying to implement the articles of the declaration, assuming they have the goodwill to do it. But let's say we assume they do have the goodwill to do it. So in the cases of education, producing something that governments can really use in the countries to say, well, these are some good ideas that come from the international arena. Here are some good practices from other countries that seem to work quite well, and so on and so forth. You know, this is a kind of tool, and I think it can have a real practical usefulness. And I think it's a lot of work for the mechanism.
The adoption of the Act on Greenland Self-Government, which recognizes that the people of Greenland constitutes a people pursuant to international law, with the right to self-determination, was truly a historical moment. The act, which is based on an agreement between the Greenland Home Rule government and the Danish government as equal partners, serves as an inspirational example to other states and indigenous peoples in their efforts of making indigenous people's right to self-determination a reality.
Our negotiations with the Danish government, of course, have been internal negotiations which have been going on for several years between Greenland and Denmark. But at the same time, as I said, there is a parallel international process which have inspired us, of course. And also, I think that with respect to the implementation of the declaration, the new Greenland-Denmark relationship could be referred to as a very concrete implementation of the declaration in terms of recognition of our own language as the official language of the country, and also with respect to the full respect for the right to self-determination.
We do think, and we have also seen evidence of that advancement in international law and international policy have an impact on the governments of the states where we now live. So it does benefit us, the developments internationally. That is the main reason. But it's also a part, to some extent, solidarity with, we of course recognize that even though we have our struggles in our areas, there are indigenous peoples that are worse off in other parts of the world, and we think by having the opportunity, we would like to contribute and do what we can help for in their struggles and they advance in their rights.
Poder saber que además nuestra realidad no solamente está reducida a un espacio en un determinado país, ¿verdad? Pero que sino que en otros continentes, en otros países también existen otros pueblos indígenas que de pronto tienen la misma problemática.
La lucha de los pueblos indígenas en estos últimos 30 años en el escenario internacional creo que no ha sido en vano. Creo que ha sido una lucha muy importante, creo que ha sido una lucha muy intensa desde luego, pero creo que esta lucha, a raíz de la adopción de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y particularmente a raíz de la creación del mecanismo de expertos sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, creo que se abre un horizonte esperanzador, creo que se abre un horizonte prometedor para nuestros pueblos. Creo que ahora, tanto en los ámbitos nacionales y particularmente en el ámbito internacional, tenemos los instrumentos para defender, para promover los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en todo el mundo.
I also like to encourage governments, indigenous peoples, UN agencies and mandates, national human rights institutions to make use of the study to achieve the implementation of the right of indigenous peoples to education. It is only by doing so that we see real value of the work of the expert mechanism on the ground. I wish you all a safe journey home and look forward to working together with you at our third session in 2010. I hereby close the formal part of the second session of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you.